For this exercise, we're going to talk about how to animate the morphing of a path from one vector shape into another. We're going to do this with some basic shapes first, and then later on we'll get more complex with some text and type. So let's get started. To get started on this exercise, you should have access to the Shape Morph JPEG. Let's jump into Adobe After Effects and create a new composition. The size is going to be 1920 by 1080 pixels with a frame rate of 24 frames per second and a duration of 3 seconds. And we'll say OK to this to see our composition. Let's import that file by going to File, Import a File. Choose your Shape Morph JPEG and say Open. And since this is going to act essentially as our background layer, I'm simply going to drag it into our timeline and lock down that layer so we don't accidentally select it. For the first part of this exercise, we're going to simply morph the shape from one shape into another all along the same timeline. To do this, we're going to draw off each of the shapes using our vector drawing tools. The tool that I'm going to use is my pen tool. Note that if you don't see it, there's some other ones that it's hiding underneath, and we'll get to those later. Set your fill color to be a solid color and something that's noticeable. In my case, I'm going to keep it a bright red. Also, set your stroke to be none, and I'm going to zoom in so I can see my triangle a little bit better. To trace off the triangle, make sure none of your layers are selected. All you have to do is click once at each of the vertices to add its own individual anchor point, and then return to your original anchor point as well. Now, one important thing to know about this exercise is that we're going to be editing the paths that we just drew, all the vertices that make up the vector shape. So if you go down to your shape layer, you can twirl open the options, twirl open the contents, and you can see it's got just one shape, and that shape has just one path inside of it. That's the vector path that we're working on. With our playhead set to 0 seconds, we're going to turn on the keyframes for that path. Now, as I move it, I want to be able to see it add keyframes along this path panel. Note that we are not transforming it. We're doing nothing to the position, scale, or rotation at all. It's only this path that we want to be able to see. So with path stopwatch turned on and adding keyframes, let's see if we can move it forward to a different thing to change it up. I'm going to scroll over so I can see my second shape. At 1 second, we want this to morph into a 5-sided pentagon. Now to do this, I'm going to use my selection tool, and here's the other key concept I want to slow down and show you. If I just select my object, notice that I have my little bounding box around each of the edges. If I was to move this object, say over to this point, notice it didn't add any keyframes. That's because we didn't change the path of it, we just changed the position of the entire layer. What we want to do is to not select just the layer, but the actual path itself. And so this is kind of a hard thing to keep in mind. To make sure you have the path selected, you can double click on the layer. This will select the shape. Then carefully click either right on the edge or one of the vertices. In this case, I'm going to click on the edge. And now you can see how it lights up each of the different squares along each vertices, and I've lost my outside bounding box controls. Now, because I selected just this edge, only those two are moving around, not what I want. If I want to select more frames, I can hold down my Command key and click and drag over everything, and now notice that all of them are lit up. Watch what happens when I move the path now. Again, double click, click on the edge, and click and drag. Then carefully click on the edge to move your shape into position. When I do that, notice that I've got a keyframe selected and it'll also be able to edit that transition that we did again. Now with my path still selected, I've got another problem. I need to be able to add some more points so that it transitions into a pentagon. To do this, I'm going to swap over to my Add Vertices tool. Then I can click anywhere along this path to add an extra vertices to my already existing triangle. From here, if I want to arrange any one of these, I can use my selection tool, hold down the Option key as I click on the vertices. Oops, just be careful that you got just that vertices selected, and I can move it into place. Now, when I do the transition, it's automatically going to transition from one into another. Another thing I'll point out is notice that because we added more points to each side, this also added points to the original triangle that we've worked on too. It'll just move it into that position right there. Let's do the same thing for the circle. So I'm going to drag it over here. We'll move our playhead over to 2 seconds. If you've accidentally deselected it, remember you can click once, double click on it, then carefully click right along the edge to select one of the key points. From here, you can hold down the Command key as you click and drag. You can get all of the points from there. Now let's move it over into position. What we want to do with this one is not just add points, but also just take these existing points and round them off as close as you can. If you need to round off a pre-existing vertices, you can use the Convert Vertex tool. With Convert Vertex, let's zoom in so we can see it. You can click on any point and click and drag, and this will give you some Bezier handles. We'll do this for each of the different vertices, just to round them off. Once you've got it set and good, you can then use your selection tool to move them all into place. Now this will take a little bit of practice, and if your circle is off by just a little bit, that's okay. The main thing is I want it to be a circular shape that gets just right along the edge, and then once you get it on the edge, you can adjust your Bezier handles to match the curve that you need for that line as well. So take some time and go slow with it until you get it nice and in place. And there's that. If we zoom back out so we can see everything, notice that I've got a keyframe on my timeline, and if I play, it'll automatically transition from one thing to the other. Remember, when we did this, we only did it to the path. If you wanted, you could also add some easing to each of these keyframes as well by selecting them, going up to Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and add some easy ease for each one. Now it kind of pauses for each step that you have. With this done, we can close up our shape layer 1. I'm going to rename it Shape Morph. And I'm also going to lock it down and turn off visibility just so that we don't accidentally work on it and it stays out of the way. For the second part of this exercise, we want to be able to transition a existing letter, or in this case number 1, into number 2. Now, both of these are pretty complex shapes. So to make it easy for the transition, we're going to go from a 1 to a simple shape like a square, and then from a square to a complex shape again, the number 2. To do this, we need to have 2 different layers. First, let's set our playhead back to 0 seconds, and let's grab our Type tool. With the Type tool selected, you can click over here on the left-hand side to add an insertion point. And notice when you do this, over on the right-hand side, you've got a variety of different characters that you can choose from your fonts and even set up the size. The font won't really matter, so I'm going to keep it at the default Helvetica and just type the number 1. With it highlighted, we can also change the size of it. And let's set the size to be big enough so that it's nice and noticeable. So I'm going to set it to be about 400 pixels. With that done, if you need to, you can click and drag it down and put it into place. Also, concerning the color of it, we can set the color of this to be something like, let's do a dark blue so we can see it nicely on our area. Perfect. With the number 1 selected, now we need to convert this from editable type into a shape. To do this, with the layer selected, you can go up to Layer, down to Create, and choose Create Shapes from Text. This is going to break apart your text layer and check out what you've got. It's actually giving you another layer called Outlines and turned off visibility for your type layer. So with Outlines selected, if you open it up and the contents, you can see it's got a shape inside of it of the number 1, and that 1 has a path. So that's what we can edit. Let's edit the number 1 going into a square. So with our path selected and our playhead set to 0 seconds, we're going to turn on a keyframe for it. Move your playhead over to 1 second. And again, we need to make sure the path is selected. I know it's selected because I can see all the vertices. Plus, when I move my 1 to this area, notice that it adds its own little keyframe. If that didn't happen for you and you accidentally deselected it, remember you can click once on the layer, double click on it, and then carefully click on an edge or vertices. In this case, I've only got one little edge, so I'm going to hold down my Command key as I click and drag, and I get all of the vertices. And again, you can move that over, and this way I've got the 1 selected for this one. Now with this done, I can start to select my individual points. Let's zoom in so I can see it a little bit better. And again, I need this to be roughly a square shape. Now I know a square has fewer points to it, so I'm just going to not delete any of these. I'm going to move them to where I want them to be just using it. So I'm going to move this one maybe down here. Let's take this little vertices guy and move it up. And we'll move this one over. And since these have Bezier, all I need to do is to flatten them out. Your square doesn't have to be perfect because this little transition is going to go relatively quick. So that'll work well for how we're working from here. Next, we need to create a 2 and then transition it from 2 to a square going backwards. To do this, let's have our outline layer selected and create our type tool. Once again, we can click once and it will create its own little empty space and type the number 2. It remembered the font and color, so that's good. With the layers selected, this time I'm going to right click, and to make it easier I can go down to create custom shapes or create a shape from the text here. Now I've got my 2 converted to outlines, and I'm going to go ahead and place my 2 where it needs to be as my starting point. Now, since this 2 is going to be ending right here, I'm going to open up my outlines layer, my contents for the 2, and then the 2 again. I want this to end as a 2 at 2 seconds. So I'm going to move my playhead to 2 seconds and click on my stopwatch. From here, I'm going to move my playhead backwards to the 1 second mark. Then I'm going to edit my shape so that it turns into a square as well. With that layer shape selected, let's move it over to this area. Again, I know it's working because I got a little keyframe on my timeline. And also with it selected, I'm going to zoom in and then carefully select the individual vertices to move them into place. Now, I'm going to deselect it to make it easier to select. So double click, and then I can click on each vertices and I can move it where it needs to be. Again, if yours is off by just a little bit, that's okay. We're simply using this as a starting point for our guides, placing things where they need to be. This is a much more complex shape, but that's okay for that. As long as you don't get rid of any of the vertices, this will work out because it's going to keep the same number of points to be able to make it more complex. We'll pull this one over here. And you can spend more time cleaning up each one of these to make it perfectly straight. Or if you want to get rid of any of the Bezier handles, this is where you can also use your Convert Vertex tool to carefully, whoops, let's zoom in so I can see it, carefully click on each vertices, and that will get rid of the Bezier handles and convert it to a straight line. Perhaps I should have done that to begin with, but that's okay. I can now go back real quickly and really easily and add these points as necessary. Again, all I'm doing is using that convert point to convert each one of these points to just straight lines, and then I can move them into place. Now let's move my selection tool, make everything line up really nicely. All right. For the purposes of my animation, that's looking really good. Now as I transition, it'll go from this block into a 2. What I need to do is I need to hide my number 1 block starting at this point, and I need to reveal my number 2 block starting at this point. So let's close out the 2 outlines layer. With this layer still selected, we want to start the time right at 1 second. So all I did was click on that and drag it to here. Then we can go to our 1 outlines layer, and we want the end timeline to end right at 1 second. So now check out what it's going to do. It'll transition from 1 to a square to a 2, making that transition go much easier. With this done, you can turn back on visibility for your shape morphs. You can test both of those out as well. To turn this in, only turn in the After Effects file. You do not have to render any portion of this exercise.